Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There have been more revelations in football sex abuse scandal. Police chiefs say about 350 people have come forward to say they were abused as children. In Greater Manchester alone, police say they now have 10 suspects. The issue overshadowed Gareth Southgate's first news conference as England's new manager. Our sports editor Dan Rowan reports.
The appointment of a New England manager usually leads to questions about teams and tactics, but with the sport engulfed in an escalating sex abuse scandal, Gareth Southgate today knew he had to face it head-on.
I played with one of the players who's recently come forward, and the reality of that, as they have said, is that they haven't felt able to speak about that until this moment. I think the world was very different 20 years ago. I think it is important we acknowledge that and learn from it. And I repeat, I think a lot of those lessons have already been learned, because that's why the situation we have now in terms of child protection looks completely different.
The scale of this scandal is remarkable. Around 350 victims have reported child sexual abuse within UK football clubs to the police. Greater Manchester Police alone have identified 10 suspects, and the NSPCC's dedicated helpline has confirmed it received over 860 calls in its first week.
We're frankly staggered at the number of calls that have been made to this dedicated NSPCC helpline since it was set up a week ago. It is unprecedented in our experience of setting up a helpline like this to get so many calls in such a short period of time.
Several people have told the BBC that they were abused by this man, former North West-based football coach Frank Roper, who died in 2005. Jason Dunford says he was one of Roper's victims while a youth player, and told me today how he felt having learned about his abuser's death.
He was so aggressive. He was certainly one that had to be brought to justice. I was angry at first, and now I'm looking at the positive. Now I've slept on it, I'm looking at the positives of him not being able to affect my life or anyone else's life anymore.
Meanwhile, it's emerged that Chelsea in the last 3 years made a payment to a former youth player who claimed he was abused by the club's chief scout in the 1970s. An internal inquiry's been launched amid reports other big clubs may have made similar payments. When asked about the consequences of clubs engaging in any cover-ups, the FA was clear.
We have clear laws and rules in the game that need to be followed, and if there's been any evidence of a breach of those, so hushing up would be one. Subject to due process, i.e. the police need to be the right place in this. When it's our turn to apply the rules, we absolutely will.
Today, former Newcastle United footballer David Eatook told the BBC he was abused by the club's former youth coach George Ormond, who was jailed in 2002 for indecent assault.
There's a lot of shame, a lot of guilt attached. A lot of confusion, and like I said, it was just impossible at that time to come out, just impossible.
And with more players set to come forward, the appalling secret that British football appears to have harboured for so long is finally being exposed. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Now, already 350 people have been reporting alleged cases of child sex abuse connected to football clubs. The number has been rising by the day following the launch of an NSPCC hotline, which has received more than 860 calls in its first week of operation. Greater Manchester Police alone say they've received reports from 35 individuals and have identified 10 suspects. And as the numbers rise, Channel 4 News tonight names another football coach who victims say may have abused dozens of young boys. Our sports correspondent, Kamian Zerum, has this.
Now Channel 4 News can name the man victims say abused them. Football coach and now named by victims as a child sex abuser, Frank Roper. Here on tour with a team of young boys. Last night, for the first time, victims revealed that an unnamed coach abused young boys in the Blackpool area for years. But Roper took his secret to his grave. It means for his victims and their families, it's not the closure they were hoping for.
He took my childhood away. and he's taken away a big part of my life. I'm determined not to let him, dead or alive, take away any more of my life. My wife and children were probably more disappointed than me because, you know, they were angry, bearing in mind that they only knew the extent of what happened to me over the last couple of weeks. So they wanted revenge, I would say, or retribution. So, you know, it devastated them more than me.
And in the Northwest, victims have told us that they believe their abusers were working together in youth football to target victims. Paul Stewart says Roper justified his own behaviour by telling him he knew another coach did the same thing.
Yeah, that was more or less what he was trying to say, you know, and how matter-of-factly he said it, you know, when I look back, just disgusts me.
This is a scandal that's affecting everyone in football. Paul Stewart used to play at Crystal Palace with a youngster called Gareth Southgate. Stewart confirming to Channel 4 News he is the man the New England manager, unveiled today, spoke of in his very first press conference.
You know, played with one of the players who's recently come forward, and the reality of that, as they have said, is that they haven't felt able to speak about that until this moment, and that's completely understandable.
Channel 4 News has been told of 2 men Roper's said to have abused who've yet to come forward, and at least another 30 who've personally told this victim that Roper abused them too. Jason Dunford says, please, if you can, speak out.
We got through the worst of this, and now it's important that for future generations of our children and your children, that we now come up with a preventive message, and we come up with preventive methods to stop the future generations having to go through what we went through.
This is now surely the biggest investigation into historical child sex abuse this nation has ever seen. In all, 17 police forces are now looking into allegations. They've received 350 reports to date, and the NSPCC hotline, set up a week ago, has received 860 calls, more than the one for Jimmy Savile.
We're coping okay with the numbers that are coming through, but it is unprecedented, and we have been staggered, frankly, at the volume of calls, concerns that have come through.
Where does it end? In Newcastle, another victim of convicted paedophile George Ormond spoke today on how being abused destroyed him.
You know, when I first signed for Newcastle, I was unstoppable. I was, you know, fully filled with confidence, and from that moment, you know, it left a big kind of space, you know, for me to feel really low confidence. So yeah, it was a horrific moment.
And the impact on these grown men who bottled up what happened in locker rooms and showers for decades is still untold.
I've suffered enough. I want to move forward. People are asking me, has this helped? I don't know yet. I'm 2 weeks down the line. I haven't yet been out in public, if I'm honest. So, you know, I've got to get back to some normality.
But what is normal when no one knows how many more of these terrible secrets football still hides?
Cayman Zaram. In a moment, we'll talk to presenter and journalist Charlie Webster, who was abused by her running coach when she was 15. But first, from Norwich, we're joined by Chief Constable Simon Bailey, who is the lead for child protection on the National Police Chiefs Council. And Simon Bailey, I'm wondering, do you have really any sense of how big a task you've got ahead of you?
Well, I think we can see from the numbers that are already in the public domain that we have a really significant task ahead of us. We are already looking at 350 potential victims, and I suspect that those numbers will increase, and I would certainly encourage any victims that have yet to have the confidence and courage to come forward to look at the numbers of people that are coming forward and follow their lead. I think it's really important that we understand the true scale of the challenge that we are dealing with, but most importantly, we ensure that the people that have been abusing them are no longer in a position to be able to carry on that abuse.
Well, I mean, Manchester police are saying they've got 10 suspects they're looking very closely at already. Do you have any sense of that kind of a number?
No, and I think those numbers will increase. There are as you know, 17 forces. It involves 55 football clubs, ranging from both the professional clubs and the Premiership right down to amateur grassroots clubs. So in the first few days we've seen incredible numbers of reports coming through, both to the police service, to clubs themselves and to the Football Association NSPCC hotline, and I suspect that those numbers will continue to grow in the next few days and weeks.
This is sensitive and difficult work, and I mean, you yourself are somebody who knew about child protection before, but there are going to be officers having to deal with this who have not really been in this sort of work before, because it's surely beyond the scale of what you're really equipped to deal with.
Well, through Operation Hydrant, which is the National Police Chiefs Council's coordinating body, we will be coordinating the approach across the police service to this. We will be deconflicting investigations, and we will certainly be making sure that senior investigating officers across the country are provided with the appropriate support. Their first thoughts and focus is going to be on ensuring the safeguarding arrangements are in place to make sure that abusers can no longer abuse, and they will then be prioritising investigations to make sure that victims get the right outcomes. We are obviously dealing with a number of years. In some cases, I suspect that abusers will already be serving custodial sentences. Some may well be dead. So there will be a sense of prioritisation and a coordination across the service, and certainly through Operation Hydrant, I believe we are well placed to do this. We have specialist officers who are trained to be able to deal with these investigations and will listen very sympathetically, very carefully to all allegations of abuse. And I would certainly encourage all victims to have the confidence and courage to come forward.
Chief Constable, if you could stay with us for a moment. Let me turn then to you, Charlie Webster. You were not abused as a footballer, you were abused as a runner. And I think your point really is that this is time not just to stop at football, but to look at the relationships in sport generally between coaches and young people.
I think even further than that, John, because I think we've reported that it's a big problem for football. It's not a problem for football, and it's not really a problem for sport. It's a problem which transcends all of sport. Yes, I was abused in running. The incredible courage of the footballers coming forward were abused in football. But it's not just a coach, it's a position of power against somebody who's vulnerable, which is why it tends to be children. And it happens in institutions where that's able, where there's power and where there's vulnerability. So not just in sport, running, football, it happens, we've heard in churches, in teaching, in any position where there is that relationship. And it's really important that we understand what sexual abuse is, because sexual abuse can happen to anybody. It can happen to a male or female. It's exactly the same act. And it's manipulative, it's cold, it's calculated. And the person who is the perpetrator doesn't show this thing on their forehead where they're this creep or weirdo. They tend to be very nice to the outward public, and they tend to be sometimes put on pedestals, especially coaches, especially in grassroots sport. My coach was seen as somebody who was pivotal to our community, and he was helping young girls achieve their dreams. And I'm sure a lot of the coaches which have been abusing the footballers, it's the same thing. They're seen as, you know, these amazing people which are really helping young people achieve their dream. And
this clearly has to be a watershed for society at large, precisely for the reasons you spell out. But the question is, you've really got 2 points. One is to bring people to being able to talk about it and tell what actually happened to them, to the police and to the NSPCC. But the other is what you do after that. I mean, do you have to think in terms of chaperones, all sorts of other resources to safeguard children in these circumstances?
I think that, you know, there are so many different things. I think, firstly, you're right. I mean, I've been talking about this for a long time now. I waived my anonymity 2 years ago, but even before that I was campaigning. I was working with victims in SARC centres, sexual abuse rape centres, and I think it's amazing that these victims have come out, because it will maybe change the conversation once and for all that it happens to both sexes, which I think is very important. It's not gender specific, and also that it's a wide societal problem that's actually disgusting and horrendous, and while we kind of turn a blind eye to it, we're covering it up. You know, the society is just as bad because we're covering it up and ignoring it. So I think, again, the definition of what it actually is really important, because I remember somebody saying to me, well, shouldn't the parents look out for them, and it's like, well, I didn't walk home and there was no signs of me. I probably covered it up. I didn't walk in the room as kind of like crying my eyes out, and also I didn't really know what's happened. So I think education is pivotal to it, not just safeguarding, and not looking internally at football clubs or the FA or governing bodies. It can't be an internal investigation. It's got to be something outward, and we have to learn from historical abuse. You know, we've seen Jimmy Savile, we've seen the football cases now, and we need to create a safe forum for victims to come forward and feel confident to, without being vilified themselves.
Well, Chief Constable, I mean, the problem, of course, is that we already have a child abuse investigation going on into historic cases anyway, and that has been terribly fraught with difficulties. Are you confident that this could be a moment when the police will be able to, in some way, to crack this and leave us in a situation where perhaps we can deal with this much more effectively in the future?
Well, I'm very confident around the police service's response to this, and there is no doubt it has got better over the last few years. And I think that is amply demonstrated by the fact that more victims are having the confidence to come forward. But I'd really like to pick up on the point that Charlie's made in terms of how we as a society build resilience amongst children and young people so that they understand when they are potentially subject to exploitative relationships or as somebody's trying to abuse them. And the fact is that by the time a victim has the confidence and courage to come forward and report their abuse to us, it's too late and the damage has been done. And society, we have now got to start reflecting upon all non-recent abuse across all institutions, be it within the church, within education, within care homes, within football or in any other environment, and say, how do we go about preventing this in the future? And my view is that by creating resilient children, resilient young people that understand where they are being abused and potentially being exploited is perhaps the greatest significant step that we could take towards achieving that aim.
Chief Constable Simon Bailey, thank you very much for joining us, and Charlie Webster, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's 2 weeks and a day since Andy Woodward took the brave step to go public with the abuse he'd suffered as a child at the hands of a football scout. And in the 15 days since, well, the scandal of abuse in football has exploded into the public consciousness, and the sport has been struggling to keep up with others coming forward with horrific tales. The police have wasted little time in following up cases, and the Greater Manchester Force said today they were investigating reports from 35 victims and have identified 10 suspects. Now, abuse scandals have touched other national institutions, and it's interesting to ask whether more will follow. But what should we make of the crisis in football? Chris Cook reports.
On another day, today's leading football news might have been a new England manager. But instead, it was about 350 people who've said they were abused during their time in football.
I think the world was very different 20 years ago. I think it is important we acknowledge that and learn from it. And I repeat, I think a lot of those lessons have already been learned, because that's why the situation we have now in terms of child protection was completely different.
It's worth remembering just how much football our children play, both formally and informally. 34% of 5 to 10-year-olds play football at least once a month. That rises to 53% of 10 to 15-year-olds and 78% of 10 to 15-year-old boys. It's the sheer scale of it as a pastime that makes abuse in football so troubling.
What we know from research is that abuse takes place when power meets vulnerability. So in relationships where children are involved, and particularly in sport, we can see that power comes from the coach's side in terms of what they have hold over the players in terms of contracts and selection and being the gateways to their future dream moves. And when we look at a young 14 or 15 or 16-year-old footballer, they're particularly vulnerable because the amount of effort they've put into getting to that place, the time they've invested, and their real motivation to want to make it to the next level. So that's when abuse can be most likely.
There has been a bit of a shift in the way that the public thinks about child abuse in recent years. Consider this. When the abuse scandals in the Roman Catholic Church first emerged, there was a lot of conversation about, for example, whether celibacy amongst the priesthood was encouraging that abuse. These days, though, after abuse scandal after abuse scandal, what's happened is that we don't ask the question, what is it about this institution that made abuse happen here? We ask the question, given that we know abuse will happen unless there are good enough safeguards, why weren't there good enough safeguards? Just listen to the tone of this announcement from 2011. You'd never hear that today.
Britannia didn't rule the waves with her armbands on, so the vetting and barring scheme were scaling it back. The CRB checks were cutting them back. And at last, let's bring some common sense to government.
Experts actually agree with the FA that football's been quite good on safeguarding.
I think the FA has, as I say, since the late 90s, taken safeguarding extremely seriously. We wrote it into the standard chartered rules that there should be safety officers. And it was a time when society was very different. For 10 years, we've had a relationship with NSPCC, which actually we celebrated in Wembley a few weeks ago, where there's a 24-hour helpline where people can speak up.
There's also no evidence that football's more prone to abuse than other sports.
There are particular risk factors around sports, such as travelling away from home or behaviours around hotels or dressing rooms when there aren't effective policies in place. And so these factors are not unique to any particular sport. People might have the myths that there are certain sports more risky because of the clothes that people wear or the nature of the sport, but there's no empirical evidence to substantiate that the risks are faced by all sports.
So the worry is not just what we're learning about sexual abuse in our favourite sport. It's that we don't have any good grounds to believe other sports are likely to be better.
Chris Cook.